Welcome to Dr Joe Unplugged. This podcast contains general information and is not in any way medical advice. 1,000 experiments can't prove me right, but one can prove me wrong. Now, this quote is attributed to Albert Einstein. He may or may not have said it. I think there's a lot of quotes that are attributed to people, but the fundamental point is a valid one, which says that the exception actually is quite important. And no matter how many studies are done to try and confirm something, and we see a lot of that these days, not just in medicine, but in a lot of science, because unfortunately it seems to be tied to funding. If you get the outcome that the funders, and in particular government and some aspects of industry want, then they'll keep sending you money. If you don't, maybe not. But the one study or the one experiment that does disprove it actually does blow it out of the water and is far more important. And it's the one that nobody really wants to hear about for a variety of reasons in a variety of different settings. The relationship between processed meat, red meat, and risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, a Mendelian randomization study. So I'll quote, "Numerous observational studies have indicated a potential association between the consumption of processed and red meat and an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes." And we hear a lot of this, and processed meats in particular are also listed as a carcinogen, notwithstanding that it essentially is not, or the amount that, and no causal mechanism has been established, and the amount that we would need to consume is way beyond what any human being could possibly do. So to quote again, "However, the presence of a causal relationship remains uncertain. Therefore, the purpose of this study was to evaluate the impact of processed meat and red meat, pork, lamb and beef, on the risk of cardiovascular disease, including coronary artery disease, hypertension, high blood pressure, stroke and type 2 diabetes, using a two-sample Mendelian randomization analysis." Now, I'm not a statistician, so I think we'll take that as read. And look, I did do a quick search to find out how it works. If those who want to, look, please do the same. Don't take my word for this. And interestingly, despite all that we hear, there's a lot of these associative studies that go on that say, yes, there's this link between red meat in particular and all these terrible diseases. Interestingly, a lot of these diseases were not as common 50 and 70 and 100 years ago, when people actually probably ate more red meat than they do today. Conclusion. The study discerned no observable impact of red and processed meat consumption on coronary artery disease, hypertension, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. The findings of this study challenge the prevailing conventional perspectives in the field. I suspect these guys won't be invited back, and it's a credit to them that they have done it and managed to get it published, because publishing medical research that goes against the grain is actually quite difficult these days. We hear a lot about science, and there was a period of time when we were told to believe the science, the term being essentially a contradiction in terms. If it's science, which is a process of inquiry, then you don't have to believe it. You don't have to believe in gravity. Just hold something up and it'll fall down. Whether you believe it or not, it's going to happen. You don't have to believe that the sun rises in the morning. It's just going to happen whether you like it or not. So if you have to believe it without any actual basis, then it's a faith, and that's fine. A lot of people in the world have faith. It's not a problem. It's quite useful, but the two are mutually exclusive. It's either scientific in inverted commas or it's faith. So why is there so much antithesis against red meat and processed meats? And there are a lot of reasons for it. And look, some people have moral or philosophical views and prefer to be vegetarian or vegan, and that's actually quite a simple answer, and that's actually quite good for those people. And if that's what you want to do for your own reasons, then absolutely that's what you should do. But the arguments against red meat and processed meats on a health basis, that it's bad for us for all of the reasons that we've mentioned here, So we first came about in the 1950s and 60s with the cholesterol theory and the work of Ansel Keys. And for those who are interested, want to go down this rabbit hole, Ansel Keys did a study looking at cholesterol and heart disease. It's called the Seven Nations Study. Problem being that he studied 36 nations and only published 7, because when he published all 36, his correlation between consumption of saturated fats and heart disease disappeared. When he had only 7 countries, the ones he selected, this nice straight line. So even back in those days, not everything is as it seems. But there is also some other undercurrents, particularly in the world at the moment, about the amount of methane gas excreted by cows. All mammals, and I suspect even reptiles and maybe even birds, I'm not an ornithologist, pretty much any living creature that has an alimentary tract, that's the GI, gastrointestinal tract, starts at your mouth, ends at the far end, they're going to put out some methane gas. Methane gas is just part of the world. It's been part of the world since the world's been spinning. But somehow, if it comes from cows, it's been made into this major problem. And look, if people think that's a major problem and want to say so, then let them say so. But it's much easier for those who want to push this line to dress it up as being, well, if you eat meat, it's bad for your health. Now, should you eat steak for breakfast, lunch and dinner 7 days a week? No. Not sure that's a good idea. There is the carnivore diet, and it does work for some people. And this is, again, it's really important that no two people are identical. So the notion that there is absolutely one eating plan that's going to work equally well for all people in all circumstances is fundamentally flawed, which again gets the whole flawed notion of dietary guidelines, which assume that everybody needs the same. We don't. Some people have different needs, and also the same person may have different needs at different times in their life. So for those who are on a carnivore diet and find it works for them, great. Other people, and I know some, have tried it and found it doesn't work for them. Well, don't continue with it. But most people, and this is human history going back to the hunter-gatherer days, when people ate what they could hunt and what they could gather, human beings are omnivores, which means that we will eat both animal and vegetable/plant materials. And how much or how little of each comes back to, as I said before, what seems to work for you. But that's your decision based on what you find works for your health. Should not be based on the government telling you what to eat, and even less so based on what ultimately is fundamentally flawed associative data and studies. So credit, and this is in the European Journal of Preventative Cardiology, and we'll put the link below. Credit to these researchers who've done the work, and credit to the journal that's actually published it, that essentially blows out of the water, and this does come back to it only takes one study to prove me wrong, basically blowing out of the water this notion that fundamentally having some meat in your diet is a problem. It isn't. Find out what works for you. It's not the only thing you should have in your diet, obviously. Find out what works for you, but pretty much ignore most of the noise about consumption of meat. Thanks for listening to Dr. Joe Unplugged. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like and share. You can also follow it on all the socials. There'll be new content uploaded each week.